This is a fascinating conversation with Dr. Tooba, who is an expert in data science and AI innovation, and CEO and founder of Amoeba AI. We dig into the opportunities of data for go-to-market teams and how AI can provide data co-pilots for powering marketers. Dr. Tooba sheds light on neurosymbolic versus predictive and transformer models for this domain, and we end with a stimulating discussion on decoding cultural characteristics around resistance versus momentum for AI adoption. Dig in. Welcome to the AI for Marketing show. I'm your host, Angelina, with many years of experience marketing in the tech industry. This show is for marketers to keep up with the pace of AI. We host conversations with innovative leaders on the leading edge, experimenting and navigating in the world of AI for marketing. And I'm truly excited to have Dr. Tooba with us today, who is an expert in data science and AI innovation, who I met only a few months ago. Actually, I was thinking back to this, but I was instantly drawn to her smarts, to your smarts, since you're sitting right here. And I self-enrolled in your fan club. So basically, because I think we were both believers in, no data, no AI, right?
Yeah,
So with that, welcome to the show, Dr. Tuba, and I'm going to call you Tuba. Doctor seems a little too formal.
yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Angelina. Very happy to be here.
Share with us a little bit of your journey, Tuba, like what got you into data science, into what you're building now at Amoeba, and maybe even break down some definitions for us along the way to understand that world a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I, by background, use the blanket term. I'm a geek by background because my start was in engineering. I studied software engineering at MIT, and then after that, ended up in what you would claim is like a very traditional engineering role at IBM. But quickly, I realized that I actually wanted to be a bit closer to business. So a lot of times, what happens is with engineering and data style roles, you end up a little bit not connected to business, but being connected to product. So I always knew I wanted to be closer to the business. So through the next couple of years, I essentially did data science like positions, whether they were in B2B companies, B2C companies, and then looking at tech policy related to AI and data to again understand that part of it at the World Economic Forum. I was studying this entire time because I think I naturally have a passion for, or curiosity, I should say, for like what's new, what's sort of like coming out. So because I was studying the entire time, I ended up doing my master's and my PhD at the same time as I was working. And my PhD was in looking at data sets that are not meant to interact. How do you design computation techniques to have them interact? Because fundamentally, there's this problem that we're producing because of AI right now, which is you're producing a ton of data, you're producing a ton of content. So I was always enamored by this idea of like you're producing all of this, but what if like your ability to digest all of that as a human and to figure out what uses there could be, what if that becomes more and more limited because the data is expanding so much? That's sort of where the thesis for Amoeba essentially came from, is this idea of you're creating so much data, but your primary goal is to run your business. And then can the data you do the heavy lifting in terms of you running your business? So it's again, it's a bit tricky for people to think about it that way because the way we think about data is like where it's in servitude to us, right? So we think about our interaction model with data normally is like you are asking it for answers, you're trying to pull things out of it, you're trying to kind of mesh it together. So this new paradigm that I'm talking about kind of inverses that relationship, where your data is kind of the main worker behind the scenes, but it's like a companion to you through and through. And its job essentially is to bridge the gap between what you know and what you need to know in terms of your business. So yeah, does that kind of cover? Sorry, I already
Yeah,
got
yeah. No, that's fascinating actually. And that had me sort of like thinking that's such an interesting perspective and at such an interesting time right now, right?
yeah.
When technologies are actually enabling us to do more with data. But then I'm also kind of like drawn back to one of a recent conversation that I had where, we were discussing how, to your point, data, we've just been piling up data, right? Like
Yeah.
we were actually kind of laughing about it that now we have like mountains of data and we have data graveyards,
Yeah.
right? Because nobody's even revisiting that data. Like it's gone, it's done, right?
Yeah.
And then you're coming from that perspective of like, to what effect, right? Like, what are we going to do with this data? And should we use this to actually drive business? So I think that's a very interesting and a very timely perspective to build a
Absolutely. I don't
solution
know
around.
if you be in the news recently, or I think over the past couple of weeks, even for like organizations that are creating these like foundational models or large language models, this is a big topic of conversation around, are we going to run out of data to train our models on, or are we running out already? To the point where, the accelerated growth that we're seeing in terms of performance of these models, does it start plateauing or tapering? So I think that it's to your point, an unrealized problem in the sense that we don't know the extent to which this will impact our future. But we definitely know that the rate in which we're creating more data is like exponentially increasing. So it's an interesting thing to think about, I would say.
So, in that respect, then you're tackling, of course, not just the problem of like leverage your data, right? Like for your business, but also it sounds like, get more efficiency out of the data that you already have,
Yeah.
because even though it's exponentially increasing, it's not unlimited, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, especially for the models and stuff. So, how do you get more efficiency out of the data that you already have? Um,
There's two sides of the same coin, right?
yeah.
One side is like, if you are creating a ton of data, again, if you can't really find any good solid uses out of it, you're going to start interacting with it less and less. So, like, the utility is a big part of this. But then the other part of this is like investment in practices to get, again, the data in a shape where you can pull things out of it. So they're two very distinct problems, but to
Yeah,
us, like, they're like two sides of the same coin, essentially.
totally. And then you are focused more and more on the go-to-market sort of function in a business. So maybe we can zoom in a little bit into data for go-to-market teams, how critical it is. What is the state like? What did you see that spurred you to get into this?
Yeah.
What's the opportunity out there, right? Like for go-to-market teams and data.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is like they're like psychologically go-to-market teams are really interesting because there's no dependability in business, like you would say, towards the top mid-funnel-ish, right? The further down the funnel you get, like traditional like AE related kind of sales processes, the more dependable your business ends up becoming. So the psychology of the go-to-market teams here, and I'm talking about like revenue operations, marketing operations, like CMOs, heads of growth, etc. That middle group has the most amount of unfiltered data to play with and experiment with, and are actually generally much more accepting of this idea of like, I'm going to try some things to see if it might work or impact my business. So psychologically, that group is a really interesting group that sits on top of data. The kind of data that they sit on top of, that in itself hasn't changed as much, right? You're either sitting on top of advertising data, CRM data. I think teams are getting better and better about pulling these sources together as well. I see more and more companies that invest in data lakes or like composable CDPs and stuff. So I see that team already is thinks about the opportunity in data is like pretty big. But then the problem that I see them facing is, and then we as humans like solved around that by like creating new functions, was around one, like in order to extract any value out of my data, like I need to get the data in a shape, which means like that's where some functions like marketing ops functions, revenue operations functions were created. It's like, can you keep your system of record in the right shape that if I wanted to extract something out of it, I was able to do so. Um, and then the other side of problem that they were facing was like, what is the thing that I can extract out of that data? What are the questions that I can ask? And inherently, what happened was both of these processes became biased. The first process became biased because you start looking at new tools and you already are anxious and sweating because you're like, what? I have to connect my data to this. So I don't even know how long it's going to take for me to actually get any value out of these tools. The second part that started creating bias was when you are the one who's asking a data question, you're biasing it, right? It's like based, you'll get an answer that's based on the question that you're asking.
Mhm.
But the questions that I'm asking are only as smart as me. They're not beyond that. Your business is not one person, your business is multiple people.
Mhm.
So while everyone got kind of anchored to certain metrics like CAC, LTV, these sorts of like marketing metrics, um, they forgot that there is like a meta goal, which is like, I want my business to get better. So you end up in a world where even though they can get some insights out of their data, they end up optimizing for these like minor metrics along the way. Sometimes at the expense of your macro goal. So both of these processes to me ended up becoming biased enough that I felt like there was an opportunity to kind of bring those two pieces together into a more cohesive, but then also like a living system that evaluates, that adjusts like as your data is like adjusting around you. Um, on the first side of it, which is like getting the data in the right shape, etc., that is always something that should be taken care of by like a neutral party, right?
Mhm.
Because you don't want to have perception at that level be
Yeah.
applied to it. You can have perception business logic applied at the semantic level, which is the layer that sits on top of like your raw data. But at the layer where you're collecting data, collating it, getting it in the right shape, there shouldn't be any kind of subjectivity. So that's one part of it. And then the second part that we tried to solve, that I tried to solve with Amoeba, was on the letting the data talk to you instead of you asking the data questions. So you're no longer in the position where you're like biasing your go-to-market motions. And the advantage for us in go-to-market teams, especially, is you're able to experiment really fast. So you're able to kind of prove out whether instinctually you were in the right direction or not, like really, really fast, right? In some cases, those cycles are as short as like 7 days. So I think that the combination of these things is why we basically ended up picking go-to-market teams. You could see impact really fast. It was a problem that they were readily facing, and we felt like we could solve it.
That just speaks to me too, because I'm obviously from the go-to-market side of the house, and I think that's very interesting, and it's so true, right? That you've just hit upon it, that the limitations of what we're going to look to,
Mhm.
for data to solve are going to be our own inherent understanding, right?
Yeah.
And absolutely, and in fact, like, so there are two macro trends that are going on, right, in the go-to-market world. One is definitely the silos are being busted,
Mhm.
right? So that's a big macro trend, and that means that we actually it's the coming together of different minds,
Yeah.
which it sounds like what you're saying is that you can actually put that on steroids with something like an AI solution, right? That can
Yeah.
actually go beyond the individualistic limitations of the sales mind, the marketing mind, the customer success mind, right? Because each of these looks things differently. And the second macro trend that's going on also is that, especially zooming into marketing leaders, right? Like they are definitely under the microscope, right?
Yeah.
Like for being able to tie the initiatives to the outcomes, right? And and what you need for that is again the help of data.
Yeah.
And if you look at the marketing DNA, majority of the marketing folks are not necessarily very fluent in data, right? Or very comfortable with
Yeah.
working with data. So I think like as I'm listening to you, I'm just thinking that yes, that makes total sense. What you're spotting as an opportunity is definitely something that's something that I'm seeing, right? Like in the field, right? Like
Yeah.
being on the go-to-market.
Absolutely. There's a new trend out that CMOs will probably end up becoming really, really good CFOs because of the amount of times you have to justify your decision making against. It's a highly critiqued function in an organization. And I want to say like, okay, now we're like we've been hearing for the last couple of years like do more with less, etc. But I honestly can't recall a time where marketing wasn't critiqued. So to me, that trend essentially has existed. And then in the new world where we're heading, obviously now as a marketer, you understand like the importance of data, but instead of having to spend your time becoming more like data literate or becoming more data fluent about things that it takes to get data there, I think that a marketer's role is better suited to like the application of like what's inside the data. So that's why I'm really excited about all these AI tools that are out there that are kind of again, like getting the data into the right spot or getting the right data in the hands of the marketer, let's say, because I think it would behoove us to have, like in the ideal world, every marketing team has like a couple of data scientists, but we
Right.
obviously know that's not going to happen. But it would behoove us to have marketers who are so skilled at marketing spend a ton of their time in learning data practices. They should instead learn how to speak the language of data in the sense of their business and what they're doing. But all of the menial work related to data should be taken care of by these AI tools, I would say.
Yeah, no, totally. And so that's been the broad trend also, right? That when we are listening in or tuning into think tanks who are talking about like the future of marketers and the future of marketing, right? There's a lot of talk about like it's going to get more strategic and more creative, right? Like that's where marketing will essentially get to shine. But to enable that, we need systems and tools like the one that you're building. Essentially, can I hire, right, like employees, which are AI employees that are so
Yeah,
smart at what they're doing, who can actually power up my strategy and my creativity, right? Like, so that's how, and which is why I think like when I first heard you and, you described what you were building, it was almost like, oh my God, I need to have this in my back pocket, right, as a marketing leader, right? Like, not necessarily like to your point, go in and build the models myself and, build these SQL queries and things like that, but really just having it as a co-pilot, right? Like with me guiding
absolutely.
my work. Um, so speaking of which, maybe you want to talk to us a little bit about like Amoeba, like what is amoeba about, and also as because marketers, like I said, are all over the range. Some of them are not that data savvy, but some, and like I consider myself coming from the data driven marketing side of the house, but even for me that meant dealing with like predictive models or lookalike models, propensity to buy and things like that, right? But I've heard you use the term neurosymbolic models, right? Like for amoeba. So I'd love for you to take us into the world of amoeba a little bit, into what is different about it also, in different as in terms of the modeling, in terms of the capabilities, right? That marketers have sort of seen until now,
Mhm.
and what is it that you're bringing to the world, right? Like, which is different and which is essentially and why it's going to be so powerful for marketing leaders. So it's a
Yeah,
loaded question, basically. Take it away. Talk to us about, your world at Amoeba.
I think I always like to say at the beginning, like Amoeba stemmed out of me trying to figure out if I was in AI, like where would it be? Because I was the person who was like kind of serving that role with marketers, right? So it stems from like really looking at what the problems were and the inadequacy of like existing incumbents and tools, why it was not able to happen before. So the inception of Amoeba is stems in like from R&D, like really, really heavy R&D, I would say. And you'll hear me joke about that all the time, where I'm like, I lose people when I say we're neurosymbolic AI sometimes, but I'm really proud of that because it changes the way how we perceive and look at data. So if you think about existing incumbents, or existing models that exist, so you brought up predictive models as an example. Predictive models or forecasting models. Now, they're great. They're traditional ML models, so they're great at certain things, but there's a heavy reliance on one, enough data, second, historical data. So imagine if there's a company like Amoeba that's starting out that they don't have a ton of historical data, right? Or a ton of data at that. So that model falls flat, but that doesn't mean their need to want to have predictability in their business falls flat. That's one part of it. But then if you think about how folks started using LLMs for data analysis. Now, LLMs, which I call them transformer models essentially, are really, really good at some things. They're kind of average at other things, and they're really bad at certain things. And it's to this day, most people are confused about what they are kind of average and bad at, right? Because they're really, really good at so many things that we tend to say they're really, really good. But at the end of the day, they are really, really good at creativity, I would say, like, things like that. They're really good at, understanding human instructions to orchestrate something. So expediting like how fast you can orchestrate something, things, processes, etc. But they're actually not really good at um, any kind of like numerical data
Mm.
because all your kind of like processes around LLMs, like if you think about um, like RAG or
Mhm.
retrieval augmented generation. If you think about chunking, this is all the stuff that we deal with in the on the back end to make sure, the models can extract anything out of the data. Chunking even like doesn't work for tabular data at all, right? It's semantic, so you can't really break a table apart
Mhm.
by random pieces and expect to extract kind of insights out of it. So
Mhm.
we decided to build Amoeba on neurosymbolic models. And what neurosymbolic models do, first of all, neurosymbolic is basically a combination of symbolic AI, which is deterministic in nature, and then a neural net. In our case, we use a liquid neural net. And the advantage of a neural net is one, it's adaptive, meaning you can play with very little data or a lot
Mhm.
of data if you'd want it. It's adaptive also to new data points getting introduced. And we know that's important now because data is changing around us all the time. So you don't need to introduce the concept of like retraining a system. Like
Mhm.
again, you used to do with like predictive models. So the advantage of using, if I was to contextualize it in terms of like business, the advantage of using a neurosymbolic model is like having the best version of a custom GPT. So think about all
Mhm.
the instructions that you would give a GPT to make a good custom GPT. So
Mhm.
imagine your ability to have that without having to give those instructions. Its job is to understand nuance around your business without you having to like govern it or self-instruct it. Now,
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that the system is perfect. So we obviously introduce things like reinforcement learning or some sort of like human in the loop feedback, of course, because you want the system to continue to get better. But what that does allow you to do is start off with a pretty solid understanding of your business, pretty turnkey in the beginning.
Mhm.
So from the beginning, you're able to look to solve problems like, and we just unveiled pipeline intelligence by Amoeba, which is like obviously our set of agents in the background, is you can uncover things that were harder to uncover before on things you brought up, the fuzzy data around like marketing influence, like demand generation as an
Mhm.
example, things that you were not able to normally measure because the journey is either too long, data sits in too many places. So things like that, where like the relationship between different activities is like not direct or linear, is where Amoeba thrives. So its
Mhm.
job is to then find the things that against your business goal, whether it's anomalous or whether it's like working well, but the things that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to pick up even if you were like looking at that data kind of straight.
Very interesting. So, would you say that it's actually going to be enabling, go-to-market teams to have very savvy data scientists on their team, or would it be more suited for folks who are already, data fluent, who would then be able to leverage this tool to kind of put it on steroids, right? Like, where does Amoeba sit in that range?
We sit actually across the entire spectrum because we have folks who, one use case is you don't have a data science team or a data analyst, and you still have the need to like
Yeah.
understand what's happening in your business. So it worked really well for those teams because then obviously you have this, and then you can use that, and then in lieu of like having to hire, onboard, train data analysts and data scientists. That, and by the way, data scientists are really expensive these days because it's a really valuable skill set to have, right? So
Yeah.
it's not a easy hire because there's a lack of enough of them.
Mm.
And then it's also a very expensive hire. So for smaller companies, having a tool like this at their disposal means they get that kind of value without the need to have to hire a data scientist or a data analyst. Now, there are teams that have data analysts. And for teams that have data analysts, it just allows those analysts to get to the answers faster. Because just
Mm.
because you're a data analyst, and most data analysts are super smart and can hack their way through a lot of stuff. But just because you're a data analyst doesn't mean that you're trained in kind of scientific principles all the time. It also doesn't mean that you want to deal with all the data engineering jobs of getting your data in the right shape, right? Your
Mm.
job is to analyze the data. So Amoeba can like expedite that. So you're just doing your core function, which is analyzing the data instead of like having to worry about like where am I getting the data from? Is the pipeline proper?
Mhm.
Like what kind of like A/B tests, etc., experimentation frameworks do I need to apply on top? And then if a team already has a data scientist, I think it's very rare, very, very rare to find um, a marketing team with an embedded data scientist. I have not seen that in my experience a lot. You might have an organization that has a data science team, but as an organization, if you have a data science team, marketers generally end up being the bottom of that list. So you end up in a queue with your data science team. Um, in a way where your data science team can like you basically I'm envisioning like a ticket number and you end up in that queue, but then when you get to your data science team again, they are there to like answer your questions or analyze something once or twice, but they're not keeping a monitoring eye on your data as an always on thing, right? Excuse me. So I think that that is what we were trying to solve, which is like, how do we give marketers or go-to-market teams a system that is always on and looking on their behalf, like having your data scientist next to you, but then also has the ability for you to ask it questions when a musing hits your brain. So both of those things kind of combine. Again, you can have a team and still use this. We have, in some companies, like even CFOs or like other functions using it as well. It's not necessarily optimized for all those functions yet, but I don't see this as a tool that, you know, it's like a replacement for members of your team. This is meant to kind of augment and like 100x the efforts that you guys were wanting to lead within your team.
Yeah, and absolutely true. But I think I've seen that range. I've lived that range, right? Like, so I've been at like large companies like Semantic, where we actually had a whole floor of, BI. We used to call it business intelligence
Yeah.
folks, right? And this was because it was the e-commerce, business that I was in. So definitely e-commerce was way ahead and very data driven. But even there, to your point, right? Like I'm recalling that you would essentially be clamoring for getting on the queue of and even within that there was quickly a reputation, right, like, of like which data scientists or which they were not even called data scientists at that time, right, but which BI guy, right,
Yeah.
like did you want to work with because they were really smart and they would essentially make you smart. But then even there, as you got into the whole ticketing process, etc., by the time you get to the BI conversation, right, the opportunity could have even passed, right?
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
loses the relevance, right? So you're absolutely right. And then I also share with you, which is which is which is an interesting thing that I also experienced at a smaller company, which was
Mhm.
an analytics company in itself, which is why I think like analytics was in the DNA. We actually did have one such individual or role
Yeah.
who was in the marketing department, who
Yeah.
used to actually go with the demand gen leader and the marketing CMO into even the board conversations.
Yeah.
So there you're seeing an example of somebody who was actually powering those conversations and helping them prepare, right, like for the board questions, etc. But again, these are like two ranges that I've seen.
Yeah.
And what you're
But
describing
It's
is you
the
can
it's
actually,
the interesting thing that you brought up, your second
yeah,
point, because I get asked this question a lot, where why are data science functions generally um, like not embedded within teams? Generally, are a team BI or data science are a team of its own. And I
yeah,
think part of the reason for that is like I was the person who used to have to go into boardroom conversations and bring data, and like my I was direct under the CEO. And part of the reason for that was like all the departments would look at that same data that I would produce in a very different way. So you needed almost like a neutral party. So even if you can embed a data scientist in your marketing team, the answer there is maybe not that you can't use them well, but be the awareness of like your department still looks biased to the
yeah.
other departments because this is your team's data scientist coming out with the answer. So having a tool to kind of supplement that, and the tool could be like your neutral party, like I'm not saying this, this is what's in the data computed by this tool. Now I'm just going to add like a narrative on top of that, makes things a lot cleaner. That's it's
Yes.
no longer like Tuba saying I did a bad job. It's like, hey, the data says we're not meeting our KPIs, and this is why. So it takes that out of the equation.
You're very, very right, actually, because also what I've seen progress, right, is we went from marketing ops to rev ops for that
Yeah.
reason, right? That it's not biased.
Yeah.
And rev ops would essentially produce that, we'd call it as like that what do you call that? One set of data, or like, the single source of truth,
And this was
right?
a tool. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, right. So that essentially, like, it's not marketing saying that, or it's not sales saying that, but it's actually this is what the data looks like, and which is interesting that you're actually elevating the application of what you're building to go to market, right? Because
Yeah.
then it transcends sales, marketing, customer success, product kind of function, and it's above all of these and sitting in the go to
Yeah.
market function.
We serve go-to-market teams, but that doesn't mean that Amoeba doesn't spit out insights that are related to your customer success team or to your
Mhm.
product team, right? As an example, sometimes the problem with what's not working could be that, your pricing and packaging is bad. Now,
Mhm.
again, you don't really have a lot of tools out there that can look at the breadth of that data, but then still streamline the output to be go-to-market relevant. But my plan, if this, obviously we're able to convince the world that this is the way to think about business, is that this ends up being like, again, a tool at the level of like a CEO or a CEO. And
Yeah.
this is what you use to run your business, right?
Yeah.
Because like instead of being goals are generally when you're doing your quarterly planning, as an example, your entire C-suite will sit in a room with your CEO, and it's like you'll be like, I need to hit this number, and then you translate that into goals for the department. If you need to hit this number, how much pipeline do I need? What's the multiple on that? All of that. But by the time your CMO goes into like with their team to translate that, they get then further diluted into a bunch of micro goals, including some of the goals end up being like, we have to host 5 webinars this month. But why? Why do we have to host 5 webinars this month?
Yeah. That's a
Right?
goal.
And then the person who's working in your team is like, I have to make sure my KPI is 5 webinars this month.
Yeah.
That's what I have to do.
Yeah.
So sometimes like those 5 webinars, like maybe you need to have three and you gave your audience like content fatigue from the other two.
Yeah.
You would, as a CMO, want to know that, and
Yeah.
you don't want to come back to the CEO or to the C-suite and say, I did tactically everything I had agreed to do, but I still
Yeah.
didn't meet my number. That's the panic we're trying to reduce.
Yeah.
If you have done everything and you're still not meeting your number, like wouldn't you want to know these things are not going to work, like ahead of you ending the quarter and it not working?
Yeah. That's a great example, actually, right? Like where goals are essentially getting broken down and interpreted into tactics. By the time they reach like a lower level, it's become like a tactic that's become a goal, which is how is it going to work then, right? Like if the goal is lost.
It becomes
Uh,
like an Asana checklist, right? It's like
yeah.
oh, XYZ. We have a new landing page. We did a new pricing page and all of
Yeah. That's a goal.
but
Wow.
whether that translates into business is like, and that's all your CEO or your board or like your
Yeah.
VCs care about is at that level.
Yeah, and then you go back, with the report card of how many tactics did you accomplish, right? And not necessarily about like verified outcomes. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so I think what I would love to maybe have from you also, given that you must be having conversations, right, like across the board with so many different leaders, what are some of the characteristics of the leaders where you're seeing momentum in adoption, of these tools, technologies, and where are you seeing resistance, right? Like, so what are
Yeah.
the factors, right, that are common factors, right, that you're seeing where there is resistance and when there is momentum?
Yeah. I think one is just in general, AI adoption is really, really high for folks who I say they have a learning mindset. They're naturally curious about tools. It's the kids who were naturally curious about playing with Legos, probably as well. They're naturally curious about tools. So they, instead of being like, I have a problem, now let me find a tool, there's a whole slew of folks who are like, I see this tool, let me use it, and then let me think about where can I apply it, which is a slightly different way of thinking than we've
Yeah.
traditionally thought. So I think that having those people in your company, they don't have to sit in marketing. In some companies, I see this function, like these people sit in like even engineering. It's a really good opportunity, by the way, for multiple teams to kind of come together and collaborate as well. But having people in your organization that have that learning mindset, and if you are a C-suite leader, creating a culture of that learning mindset, I think is really, really important because if you're not going to try these tools, you're going to get left very far behind. So I think that's first and foremost. I think where we see a lot of adoption is, again, most go-to-market teams experiment a ton. They have fatigue because there's so many tools, but they also like love the idea of like a brand new thing coming up and them trying it and them talking to their peers about it. So you see a lot of adoption being in that go-to-market team circle.
Mhm.
The inverse of that is they're quick to adopt and they're quick to churn as well.
Mhm.
So I think that onus is on the folks producing the tooling to make sure that their tools provide enough of an ROI early enough that the tools become sticky.
Yeah.
There's a rise of this role within organizations. I call it an AI evangelist. There's a person in an organization who will generally meet with all these like different vendors of tools, will go back to their like entire company and make a business case for like, I think this is something worth trying. And that's an attempt because a lot of organizations are being told now to be AI forward, right? So there's a rise of like this new kind of dimension within teams themselves. Where we see a lot of friction is two places. One is that, well, I guess three. One is the fear of like these tools require a lot of like scaffolding around it to like kind
Mhm.
of get it plugged into the system. So all ops functions generally are scared and petrified of new tools. I raised my hand because I also was one of those people because you're like, okay, now I'm gonna have to kind of get through like all of the IT security stuff, and then I have
Yeah,
to
yeah.
think about like what data to connect in, blah, 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 all of that stuff, right? So there's a fear mongering that happens in our heads. The second resistance, or I wouldn't say resistance, but I think this is where folks are starting to kind of build better pathways, is on the data sharing side. There is a lot of
Mhm.
anxiety around these tools being used to train proprietary models or being like, where is my data sitting? Where is my data
Mhm.
housed? So those are like your chief data officers, your CISOs, like information security officers. Some companies even have chief AIOs. Some companies have
Mhm.
like these like AI task forces. So that is like the risk aversiveness for like you're sitting on top of. You just want to make sure your data is like not going in random places. It
Mhm.
actually brings to the point of like you were bringing up earlier. It's like this newer trend of tools being more successful if they're on-prem, meaning your data as an organization doesn't leave, and then we just are the processing layer on top. So I think that's where we'll see friction, but I think that friction will continue to go away. I think folks who are creating the tooling need to do the service of building better partnerships with that side of the business to educate, to convince them, and then also
Mhm.
design things in a way that alleviates the stress that they have in their head about like, where's my data going? Like if I go into an organization, it's my job to make sure that they feel like the data is protected and safe.
Mhm.
And then they understand very clearly what is happening with their data, which is a
Mhm.
step a lot of people miss. Like there's a
Mhm.
tiny bit of, I would say, consultancy that comes into play here.
Mhm. Mhm.
I am better equipped, my tool is better equipped to help you be successful if I do the job of making sure you educated on what the tool is meant to do and how.
Very interesting. In fact, as I was listening to you, I'm just also brought back to a recent episode that we recorded on marketing operations bearing the torch, right? Like for AI adoption. And I was kind of thinking about marketing operations as the group, right? Like, which is essentially going to be bringing in these tools and technologies and play
Yeah.
with them. But what you said actually is also a very interesting psychology point about marketing operations that they are basically also. I think the words you used is that they're like, oh God, like another tool, right? Like another integration, right? Like so.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, those are really good points to even keep in mind as somebody who is building these tools and who is essentially going out and marketing that you want to be aware of, right? Like, what are the characteristics, right, to look out for
Yeah.
and to educate. right? Like to educate them proactively
Yeah.
on where the data is going to go, how it's going to get used, the privacy security aspects of it, and even educating them on the successes, right, that are possible, right? Like they may not even be thinking about, right, because they're so siloed in their thinking.
Yeah, we call this in the early days, obviously all of our design partners were in Slack with us because we like keeping good iteration cycles.
Yeah.
And the one question that always used to come up is like, am I doing this right? And like if I'm the builder of the product and my end user is saying, am I doing this right? I think the onus and responsibility is on me to make sure that, obviously answer the question, but like also make sure that the product functions in a way that that's no longer a question of like, am I doing this right? So I think understanding to your point, the capabilities of like what that tool can do and like alleviating that tension in the teams of like, it's another tool I have to plug in. All of that responsibility should sit on the side of the folks who are building the product. That's why you see um, products like Clay sometimes be so successful because they invested heavily in education,
Yeah.
right? So like they put out and they obviously did a really good job of like having a bunch of other like clay, I think they're called clay agents or clay agencies, etc. A bunch of agencies who are able to then talk through how I implemented it for my kind of organization, etc.
Yeah.
So that information already makes it a lot easier for folks to kind of envision that within their organization. So for anyone who's listening to this and who's building the product, I think investing in these things early on makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Totally. I think like what you talked about having a Slack community, right? Like with your design partners. I mean, it's a great idea. In fact, I think I'm gonna potentially use it also because I'm myself brokering a lot of design partnerships.
Yeah.
Just because it's organically coming up, I'm talking to someone and I feel like, oh, they could be great for another person, right? But having a Slack community just brings that not just the intimacy to the relationship, but also the availability, right? Like if there's a question, then you're available. If there's a thought that sparks, then there's an availability. But then as you grow, you
Yeah.
can't necessarily scale, right? Like with those kind of platforms. And that's where I think like having the Clay University sort of a model, right? Or having really good documentation, or even, I mean, there are AI solutions coming out where they're creating fantastic demos, right? Like product walkthroughs, right? That so essentially investing in education, right? And holding their hand at scale
Yeah,
would be very helpful in adoption of these newer technologies because it's new, right? It's uncharted territories, right?
absolutely. And like I actually feel like even if your organization scales, um, we in my panel the other day with Queener, we talked about this concept of like everboarding, which is like there's no longer a single onboarding. You're just forever
Yeah,
onboarding, right?
yeah,
And this is a complaint that I hear from go-to-market teams a lot. It's that, they a person in your team is really, really excited to bring a tool in, as an example. And then they're like, I brought it in, I made a business case, we're spending X amount of money on it and then it falls flat because it doesn't get adoption or the right kind of adoption within the organization. So I feel like that's also part of everboarding is that, the tool, people who own the tool, who are building the tool, need to help those evangelists
yeah,
within like we run sometimes just like workshops around AI, just like informing an organization of like what exists in AI. Not all things, Amoeba is not best suited for like everything, right?
everything. Yeah,
But I know that I can make a better case for Amoeba if my end user and like their organization is better informed of like all these different things. If they know that
mm,
I am their champion trying to solve a problem for them. So I think like it's psychologically, I'm curious for your thoughts on this also. Psychologically, it's a very interesting time because you would imagine with all these AI tools, we're becoming less and less relationship oriented, but I think it's the opposite. The value of relationships now, again, from like a founder to a customer or from like a builder to like an end user, the value of this relationship now is ends up becoming in some cases the moat because they will tell me outset like if you add XYZ feature, this will make it a better product. But if I had just said, okay, here's the tool, now use it and stepped out, chances are that's not intel I would have like ever gotten, right? So you should be trying to make them successful and like vice versa.
So much in there, right? Like, so one is definitely, I did listen in on that conversation that you had with Brett Queener, I think, and Everboarding was something that even I had never heard of before. And once you hear it, it becomes like, yeah, right? Like, what a lovely term, right? Like, it makes
Yeah,
total
totally.
sense to continually invest, right? And continually be alongside, right? Like the
Yeah.
customers that you brought on. And honestly, just like you were talking about, like the AI evangelist, new role that's being created, maybe there'll be a role, and maybe Tooba, you can do that since you're the CEO and owner, and you're running your own show. You can have a role called the Everboarder, right? Which is essentially kind of like sitting with customer success. Um, my perspective actually on what you just talked about, that is it actually going to reverse, right? Like that, the thinking that it may make things a lot more machinic, right? Like with AI versus it becoming more relationship driven. Actually, we had a very interesting conversation on this show
Yeah.
with Saira Nazir, and we talked about actually how this age of the AI tools and the AI help that's being unleashed is actually going to free up time that
Mhm.
we're going to be able to invest in community and
Yeah.
invest in relationships more, because I'm not doing the grunt work anymore. So I can actually look up and think about creativity and strategy. And for
Yeah.
that, I need to work across the aisle. Right. And so we were kind of like talking about it. There's a whole segment on this, right? Which is that this is actually going to allow us to be a lot more community driven and actually bring more balance, right? Like for us, because we're going to work with other humans more, right?
I think so. I think like I never like, I've never seen a marketer's eyes light up looking at a dashboard, but I see like an inner light when they're hosting these like C-suite dinners or like when they're like, it just like it's such a relationship oriented role to begin with.
Yeah.
Mm. And yeah, the communities are back. I don't know how many times I can say that.
Yeah.
Communities that like people had fatigue from them, had gone away, but the idea of communities, the idea of having like Slack communities, Discord communities, even if it's just your users griping about the product, but this idea of like we're in this together and like let's all try to help each other. There's also, I don't know if you're noticing this trend, but there is a big trend in people really being like relationship wise, like supportive of like trying to help each other navigate in this AI world as well. So I think I have a lot of faith in like it creates better, more human relationships. And to your point, like all the menial tasks end up with AI, so we can open up more room. Like I
Mhm.
joke like, where's the AI that does like my laundry? And like all the menial stuff, things that I want to sort of give up. So
Yeah.
I think like automatically your mindset will shift from it's here to take my job to like it's here to elevate me so I can, focus on the things that really matter and that humans are really good at, which is like intuitive, creative things.
I'm with you on that, Tuba. And that is why I think I was drawn to you, right? Because I think it's there to enhance, right? It depends on how you're looking at it, and we can take its powers and actually enhance
Yeah.
our experience of this finite life that we have,
Yeah.
right? So with that, I think we'll probably wrap it up. But Tuba, like, I'll definitely like drop links in the description on, how folks can reach you. But congratulations also, by the way, on your product drop that just happened this week.
Yes.
And if there's any lasting message or thought that you want to put in, please do.
Yeah, I think my only lasting message, obviously you can, connect with me on LinkedIn or like go to amoeb.ai, which is our website. But um, if you ever want to talk about things data or AI, like I'm a big core mission of Amoeba is again educational as well. So that's my only message is like Amoeba doesn't have to be as a product the right fit for you.
Mhm.
But if these are topics and subjects that you're interested in, I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about that.
Awesome. That is amazing. That's great. That's very much needed, by the way. So thank you for putting out there. And thank you so much for taking your time out. I know it's been an incredibly busy week for you. Very happy for you. Looking out for like the growth of Amoeba for sure. And thank you so much again, Tooba, for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.